started. Dr. Gavin Fulmer is an assistant professor of curriculum teaching and learning at the National Institute of Education in Singapore. Gavin's research focuses on the development and use of assessment, in particular the role of alignment between curriculum and assessment in teachers' instructional decisions, as well as applications of ROSH measurement in science and math education. Prior to joining NIE, Gavin served as Associate Program Director in the Division of Research on Learning of the U.S. National Science Foundation. His previous professional positions include appointments with the George Washington University, WestStat, and the University of Washington. He holds a BS in Math and Physics from the University of Redlands and a PhD in Science Education from SUNY Buffalo. And I thought I'd just mention how I got to know Gavin. Gavin actually wrote a paper about alignment methods, and you might know that I do a lot of work on alignment, and I read it and started working on a response to the paper and emailed him asking for some suggestions about the code he used in doing his simulation, and we ended up working together on the paper, just got accepted for publication, and Gavin invited me to participate on an NSF review panel. So you never know how these things are going to work out. So the moral of the story is, feel free to email authors and make suggestions. I'm excited to hear Gavin's talk today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Morgan. And hello, my name is Gavin. And you'll notice my second name isn't Iris Lee. I'm giving some credit to a colleague who is working on the research project that I'll be talking a bit about today. Although the statements and opinions expressed are entirely mine. So I'm going to talk a bit about some bridging policy and practice for assessment, and I'm going to talk a little bit in general about the Singapore system, and then I'm going to talk more specifically about a project that we've just begun that addresses issues with teachers' understandings of assessment and practices with assessment in Singapore. I thought I'd share a picture so you can see what the city is like. This is the downtown and the Marina Bay area of Singapore at night. It's quite beautiful. So it's a really interesting, vibrant city. It's in a space smaller than, I'm not sure how it compares to LA, but it's smaller than the Washington D.C. Beltway, and 5 million people live there. So it's a very, very urban, exciting place. So just to let you know where we're going for the talk, so the general outline. So you may have heard of Singapore before and how it's successful in school. Very high performance on a lot of international assessments like PISA, TIMSS, and PEARLS. If I recall, it was third in science in PISA 2009. It was fourth or fifth in PEARLS and in PISA reading literacy. In PISA for reading, it was the highest performing country that's tested in English, outperforming the UK, the US, Australia. Even though it's all schooling is in English, but for people from the UK, they wouldn't feel that English was a strength there. But they're outperforming all of the other English-speaking countries on English as well as math and science. So they're doing something really, really well, right? And it's really frequently visited by scholars from all over the world. We have, in the 6 months that I've been there, we've had colleagues from the US, from the UK, Germany, etc., to visit, to find out what the Ministry of Education is doing, what the National Institute of Education is doing, to see the schools, etc. They all want to learn about what's happening in Singapore that makes it so successful. And one of the big differences with Singapore compared to particularly the US, but other places in general is that it has a single, centralized, and really well-coordinated education system. There is one Ministry of Education. There is one Teacher Training Institute, which is the National Institute of Education. And all of the schools are directly or associated with the ministry, and they have a set of national curriculum, one set of national assessments. So with all that in mind, there are relatively few noticeable gaps between policy and school and teacher practice in terms of, once a policy is established that this is where we want things to go, it's usually quite fast that that's enacted. And I thought I'd give you a little bit of background about some of the sort of key principles behind the Singapore system. The first is the idea of meritocracy, which is that anyone with merit who can demonstrate merit can succeed and do well in society. And the philosophy behind that is to try and make it so that a person's socioeconomic background, their cultural background, family, are not going to be predictors of how well they can do in school or how they can do in career. And they see that their education system should be a central part of that, that model. And it's also very much an assessment-driven system. So they have, every student takes the primary school leaving exam, the PSLE, and then students who go on to, in secondary school, they take either the express or normal academic streams. They take O-level exams, which are similar to the UK O-level system. And then for those who go on to junior college and advanced courses, they take the A-level. So O for ordinary level and A for advanced level. I was telling Morgan that about the PSLE, the primary school leaving exam, that's taken when students are finishing the 6th grade in primary school. And the role of assessment in the national culture is really important. So when, in the run-up to the PSLE, parents might take off of work to sit at home with their students while they're preparing for the exam. I have some colleagues who I was saying, oh, well, we have a visitor coming, do you want to have dinner? Well, no, I'm going to stay home. My daughter's getting ready for the test. This could be in the month or two before the exam takes place. And the day that the exam results were released, the traffic was unusually light because people went home early so that they could be with their kids when the results were found. These are 12-year-old students figuring out which school they're going to get into for the secondary school. So this assessment has a strong role in the current culture, and there's also some historic connection to like 70% of Singaporean people are of Chinese descent. So there's a strong cultural connection with assessment in Chinese culture. And a system is tracked or streamed. There are tracks within schools. As I mentioned in passing, there's the express stream, which is kind of considered the higher performing stream. There's normal academic, and then there's normal technical. And those are different streams. Those exist within every school. There are these three streams. And then different schools have different ranks or bands. And then at different times in Singapore's history, how public or how the ranks were publicized or emphasized has had more importance or less importance. But so right now they're entering a period where they're de-emphasizing the ranking and the banding, but that doesn't mean that people don't know. That it's just not, they're not releasing, but people remember which schools have historically been the best, and they always want to get those students into those. And all of that tracking and streaming are based on student standardized exams, the PSLE especially, and then the O-level for when they finish secondary school. And these are set by the Singapore Examinations and Assessment Board, a division of the Ministry of Education, and they are there's no role of you know, a letter from recommendation letters from family or an essay or anything like that. There's just the exam score, and then what you get determines where you go. Yeah.
Is there choice? So for primary schools, is it by geographic area, or are I'm not understanding the system in terms of, do parents have the choice to send their kids to any school they want, and how does that?
Yeah. So for the primary school, they typically go to schools in their neighborhood area, unless the parents want to pay to go to a better like private school that they choose. And then there is, for some of the private schools, which still have to follow the Singapore curriculum system, unless they're like a foreign school, they will have there will be some competitive entry to get into the school in the first place. But the majority of the students go to, for primary school, go to the school in their neighborhood.
And then secondary.
And then secondary, they could go anywhere in the island.
And those are admission-based.
That's right. And the admission to the secondary school is competitive. So schools try to improve their current student score so they can improve their appearance for future enrollments to be more competitive for students.
So you said standardized assessments, but I mean I did O-level and A-levels, and they look, they do have multiple choice components.
Yeah.
But they were certainly a lot more writing based, and they wouldn't look like a US, what we would call standardized assessment in the US.
Yeah.
When I didn't fill in the bubble until I was 16, and then it was only a small part of what I did. So are these exams more like US kind of standardized assessments, or are they different?
There's a combination. So, but I think at the primary level, there is quite a bit actually of the bubbling and short fill-in actually, and multiple choice is quite popular. But they do have some open-ended, especially for the O level. And then for the marking of the exams, they have a moderation process that they do among all of the teachers. But that moderation is managed by the SEAB, so that I think in parts of the UK, the initial marking is done by teachers in the school in which the students are enrolled, but there the marking is done across schools in order to kind of increase the independence of the mark. Now, so with that backdrop, in recent years there's been some change in the Singapore policy in response to kind of changing environment and changing goals. And those are pretty interesting to talk about. One is the ministry is indicating a lot of shifts in their focus in terms of how they want the curriculum to look, what types of outcomes they want for students. And you can tell from just from the titles, you can get a feel for what they're trying to get across. Thinking schools, learning nation, teach less, learn more, curriculum 2015. And I think with you compare that with movement in with the Common Core standards or the next generation science standards, you can, even with just the titles, you can see some similarity in the direction. And particularly with the curriculum 2015, there's been more interest on emphasizing 21st century skills and competencies. And they've also been doing loosening quite a bit of the idea of tracking, at least in the public expression of it. So they are discouraging public ranking of schools using the assessment results. So students are still taking all of the same tests, but they're not releasing them to the newspaper anymore. And whereas they had previously had, at the national level, the top 10% students were actually, their names were printed in the paper, so you could find out who were the top 100 or 1,500, whatever. But they don't do that anymore. They're also discouraging that even within the schools. Instead of having like a big public list on the wall that the students walk up to it, that it's more individual and it's not made as publicly competitive.
And their rationale for that, is it public that they talk about?
Well, so the statements from their ministers of education indicate that they want to encourage students to see education as being less about getting the score just for the sake of the score. So they're trying to encourage students to think about what they're becoming as persons, and they're increasing the use of language about sort of character development, citizenship, and sort of a holistic child development of the child instead of for the sake of the assessment. So that, and I'll talk a bit more about that as well. Yeah. And the tracking is they're shifting to be a little bit less constrictive in the tracking, so that to make it easier for students to shift tracks if they desire, or if they're in secondary school and one of the tracks that wouldn't traditionally take O levels, to let students try the O level. So these policy shifts, they at the sort of curriculum and student outcomes level, those require some shifts in the types of assessment that students take. And so one of the goals that they've emphasized is to try and support and assess students' 21st century skills and dispositions and values. They specified a set of dispositions and values and skills that they would like to see students develop, and that they are trying to determine how to assess. They are also trying to spread assessments away from just the final exam, and to have more weighting than just 80% of the year's score is from one day of test. To have assessment tasks and events take place over the course of the year. They're also trying to encourage teachers to use a classroom assessment not only for the sake of practicing for the test, but also as a form of formative assessment, or to have that count towards their marking and assessment at the end of the year. And as I mentioned, there's increasing the use of language like holistic assessment. They haven't defined what that means, but it's typically been understood, and the way it's communicated seems to indicate either some sorts of portfolio or performance assessments, or assessment that draws on skills that are not only measurable by multiple choice questions or the types of assessments they typically use. But again, I put holistic in quotes because it's still undefined in terms of what they expect that to mean. And one of the interesting features with the system that I've noticed there is that they will have a statement about policy and ask schools and teachers to interpret that and work on some. For example, they'll say, okay, we have a broad vision for holistic assessment, and then different schools will try to figure out how they would interpret that and act on it, and then report back to the ministry of what they did. And then a few months later, the ministry might identify some exemplars from that exercise, and then share that with other schools. So it's kind of a recursive process there. So those changes in assessment have implications for what teachers have to do with assessment in the classroom, what they understand assessment to mean, and how they communicate that to their students and to parents. But at the same time, in some previous work that colleagues have done, they actually find that the practices of teachers' assessment in school, it tends to be relatively low intellectual quality. It tends to be rather kind of lower order thinking, focus on rote recall of facts, very basic demonstration of understanding, things that are easily measured by multiple choice questions. And if you ask teachers, why are you, what's the purpose of schooling? In these previous studies, I've argued that it's preparing students for these exams, because that's the meter stick by which they will be measured, and that has implications for their future. So that is the purpose of school, and that's both for schooling itself and in the particular tasks that they choose on any single day. So as the policy towards what they want school to be, what assessment might be different, changes, and that may have implications for what teachers are going to have to do with their classroom instruction, with their assessments that they use. So that's created a lot of concerns within the country about whether or not they actually are able to make that transition. So whereas there has typically been this sense that the policy appears and we act on it, there are more concerns being voiced about, is this a policy that we can act on quickly? So are teachers ready, willing, and able to implement assessments that the policy requests? So in the project I'm going to talk about now, we address one aspect of that, which is the teachers' conceptions of assessment, or their underlying beliefs about what assessment is and its purpose. And then we are developing a project to examine the policy, contextual, and cultural factors that may influence those conceptions and their practices for assessment.
Can I ask another context question?
Yeah.
What's the accountability for teachers? Is there an evaluation? Do test scores get factored into teachers' evaluation?
Yeah, that's it. They don't use a value-added model approach. They use like a ranking and banding type of approach, and it's based on within a certain year what the typical. Let me back up. What they had typically reported when they reported scores for students before was not some standard or sort of, for example, meeting standard or proficient or advanced, but rather they reported a T-score, which is similar to a Z-score. It's a normalized score. So essentially, every year they reported where a student was with relation to all of the other students who took the test. And then that approach was also used for evaluating schools and for evaluating teachers. In terms of how this teacher did compared to all the other, how those students did compared to all of the other students in the country and in the school.
And has that changed, I guess, is my question? Because if you change one policy, but you leave in the teacher evaluation tied to the same measures, it seems to me.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, there hasn't been a public discussion about whether that's changing. The nature of how public a change in policy is in Singapore is not as public as in the U.S. So it's not stated whether or not how that's changing. There is some implication that it would change, but hasn't been publicized what exact change will be.
Because as a teacher, that would really influence my approach to assessment. I mean, I might continue with that same mindset about the end of your test is really what matters, if that's going to be what I'm doing.
That's right, yeah. And that's one of when we talk with teachers individually, we also ask them about, what do you think about these changes? And one of the points they raise is that, the official policy or the guidance about curriculum and what they want to be taught, encourages that, and we like that. That's interesting. But the PSLE is still, taken over 2 weeks at the end of 6th grade, and that's still the only thing that students have in order to get into the good secondary school. I think that is a good point. That it's both for their own evaluation and the evaluation of their students. That's one of the gaps that teachers are understanding is, the statements about what they want, what the ministry wants instruction to look like, versus what is actually measured and assessed. And so that's part of one of the things that we want to understand with the second point here is to look at, not just what do the teachers believe about assessment or the purposes of assessment for their classroom, but also how is that affected by particular policies or contextual factors within the school. So I thought I'd take a moment to sort of talk about why we're looking at the conceptions of assessment idea instead of just looking at practices of assessment or other types of things. One argument is that, of course, teachers implement the assessment policy at the classroom level, the way it's constructed to encourage the idea of holistic assessment and performance on portfolios. The teacher is the person who does that at the school, and the teacher's conceptions of assessment or underlying beliefs about what assessment is, that's the lens through which they interpret what type of information they have to gather through their assessment practices. And so we see that this is a way that it influences their practices and it connects the broader perspective of what the school's policy is with their decisions for practice. And in some prior research, there has been demonstrated to have this connection between this conception of assessment and their actual practice. So we argue that it's really key to understanding the challenges in the transition based on the policy change.
Is there actual research that has linked COAs to real outcomes?
Real outcomes in terms of like the student level? Or?
Yes.
What's real?
Well, like to student achievement or to even to intermediate measures. So, you know, COAs do affect whether I implement something which do affect student achievement. Have those links been made in research?
So the former that you mentioned, so the COAs with the teachers' assessment practices, that's been demonstrated. Yeah. The connection between the particular assessment practice and student understanding or student learning outcomes, that's not as clear. And I think one of the issues that I think is there to be still figured out is making a better connection between the day-to-day assessment tasks and what is the assessment outcome that we're connecting it to. So particularly with a policy that is designed to encourage like 21st century skills, in the Singapore context, the PSLE doesn't measure that. So the question is, well, if we want that, we want more of that, but we're not measuring that. So what's the balance in the decision about, you know, are we willing to accept no change on the PSLE outcome, but still have this increase in the use of assessment for 21st century skills at the classroom level? So.
But the PSLE is, the sole purpose of the PSLE is to rank kids.
Yeah.
Then, I mean, the ranks, if everyone implements the policy, then would the ranks even change? Like, how would you even know if the policy was effective?
Yeah, that's right. That's a good question. As a foreign employee of a Singapore government agency, I can't talk about Singapore politics. But that's an interesting point to me. And so in general, like the idea that if everything that's reported is norm referenced and then everyone's doing it, then does anything change about the ranking? One counterpoint could be that some schools may better adjust their instruction or their practices to the policy, and then if the assessment changes to, for example, if they find ways to incorporate measures of 21st century skills into their standardized test, then the schools that are better at developing assessment tasks over the year that support that, then they will see differences. But again, what's still not clear is how or when they would incorporate things like 21st century skills or higher order thinking skills type of assessment into their standardized tests. That's still not clear. And that's one of the sort of fundamental challenges that teachers raise when we talk with them. So as a background on COAs, there are a couple of different frameworks that have been proposed for conceptions of assessment. One from Brown out of New Zealand, and another from James and Petter out of London at IOE in London. And you can see some similarities in terms of some of the language. Brown's framework focuses on the types of assessment related to improvement, either at the school level or the student level. The idea that through assessment we can improve, versus school accountability, student accountability, or a conception that assessment is irrelevant. That in his work, a small number of teachers actually, they believe that, and they don't believe anything else. But typically, the majority have some set of beliefs about that assessment is either for the purpose of improvement or for some type of accountability. The other two, improving students as a sort of making students better as opposed to improving their learning, or controlling teachers and students, those were not found in sort of traditionally Western samples like Australia, New Zealand, or in Europe, but were found in China and Hong Kong. And James and Petter, that work is in the UK, and they find teachers have their conceptions of assessment are focusing on sort of making learning explicit, or promoting autonomy, or performance orientation. And the performance orientation has a lot of similarities with the accountability concepts in Brown. But in general, the Brown, the way it's conceptualized and the way the items are written are in a much more broad sense, sort of policy-focused sense. And James and Petter's, the way the items are written, what it asks teachers about are more on about the classroom practices and what they believe are appropriate for the classroom. So we are incorporating, combining aspects of both in order to understand at a broader view and at a particular instructional decision. And as you can imagine, based on these conceptions and how that relates to the types of practices that teachers use, in prior work they've found that teachers who believe that assessment is more related to accountability or performance orientation, they focus more on summative type of assessment practices. And teachers who are who have a greater belief that assessment is for the purpose of improvement of students or of themselves, or making learning explicit, they are more likely to make use of formative assessment practices. So this is a connection between the belief and the decisions they actually make about how they develop and use assessment. So in this study, we are going to measure the COAs at one time through a survey. And we are studying the policy, cultural, and contextual factors that may influence them. And one of the goals is to establish a knowledge base that could help as levers for future interventions with teachers and schools to see how can we help the teachers conceptualize assessment in a way that helps them implement the policy that they're supposed to do. We also hope that it could be a useful baseline for some future evaluation of these initiatives. So we're doing a study. It has two parts, an instrumentation part and survey. So we have, I mentioned by Brown and by James and Petter, we have instruments from them. We are also conducting a focus group study to understand the possible policy, cultural, and contextual factors that are related to conceptions of assessment, and we're developing a questionnaire on that. And so I'll be talking about that part 2, phase 1, part 2, today. What remains to happen later on is the second phase, which is the survey itself, which is a representative sample of teachers from all Singapore schools, and they'll do a survey. So the focus group study that we did, we conducted focus groups with current teachers, teacher leaders, and with teacher educators at the Education Institute. We began with kind of a general discussion about what we mean by COAs, and so that we don't sort of come in cold. And then we asked them to consider the different aspects of their ideas, their understandings of assessment, or of, for example, with teacher leaders or teacher educators, what they see affecting the teachers with whom they work. And So we have conducted focus groups, and now we're finalizing the analysis and developing questionnaires. So as you can imagine, there are sort of three general levels at which the teachers feel that there are influences. There's at their own level, the teacher factors that they feel. There are, at a macro level, the sort of national culture policies that affect them. And then there's this intermediate level of within their schools or the teams that they work with, departments for example. And at the micro level, one of the key points is that teachers feel that there's both an aspect of their competence, how they feel that do they actually understand the distinction between assessment that's summative or formative. They understand do they know what the policy means about holistic, or how to implement that. One of the other points that was raised with in the focus group is that all of the teachers are trained in the very same institution, and so if they don't know, that should be something that could be fixed relatively easily. Instead of, there's no comparable online institution like we have in the U.S. that people can take things online or at any university that they want to, but there's only one place that they can go to become a teacher in Singapore. So maybe figure out what's going on there, that the teachers come out not understanding the different types of assessment. And then there's some discussion about the content knowledge background. This is raised especially when people talk about primary school. This comes up in the U.S. as well, that if the teacher is asked to assess using a more open-ended assessment practice in mathematics or science, but that's not a content area they're comfortable with, then it's difficult to sort of cede control of where a task is going if you don't know how to respond to the types of questions that students can raise. So the content knowledge is also brought up. And then there's another aspect is the idea of the teacher's sort of sense of competence or self-concept about it, and whether they have role models that they can turn to. Again, this is not content knowledge directly, but their sense that they know the content well enough, or that they're willing to admit they don't know the content well enough to work with students on it. And this part of that is the giving up the epistemic authority of being the knowledge source to students, and that's an interesting aspect of the power dynamic in school. And also the role of role models and exemplars that the teacher has, either at the school or at when they were at the training college, etc. That they can say they have seen assessments like this, and they understand it, and they can feel that they can develop that. At the meso level, we identified some things related to school culture and leadership support and goals. So, for example, some school leaders, they emphasize the ranking, and so they push for test prep, and that means a focus on what our focus group respondents call outcome-oriented assessment, meaning the test prep, getting scores, getting the ranking. And in one example, the teacher is talking about how the leader is talking about we want to be able to say how many students that went here got what rank. We need to put a banner up in front of the school saying how many students got into this junior college or this university. Other teachers are talking about that the school culture, the leadership is supporting the idea of learning outcomes. Not how many got through the gate, but what are the students learning? How are they developing as citizens, into people who are going to be successful in the 21st century, and that helps them focus on sort of process-oriented assessments, and looking at performance over longer periods of time as a single test.
So I'm not understanding process-oriented assessment.
Yeah. So for example, one type of thing might be instead of a test that they take in one instance about some key aspects of Singapore's history as a migrant nation. It's a very multicultural city, and they are really proud of the different historical ways of immigration and how they have blended together. So that could be, you could develop an assessment as a test, but some other schools are practicing things where they have students go in teams to do interviews with individuals in some of the different immigrant communities and neighborhoods around the city, and then develop reports about what they learned, what that connects to what they're reading in the book. And so that's about the process of getting information from the individuals that they interviewed, developing that into a document and presenting it, as opposed to, were they able to demonstrate that they knew what proportion of different ethnicities and when they started appearing. So that's one example. And then another of these kind of school level effects is the sense of support and environment from their other teachers that they feel. And that includes having support teams who can help them maintain their formative assessment if they've already used it or tried to adopt formative assessment practices if they haven't used them before. Or on the other side, if there's a lack of support from mentors of some kind, whether that's in an official capacity or an informal capacity. And teachers feel that can prevent them from being able to sort of continue using assessments that are different from exemplars of the final year test. Then we have, at the macro level, there's, I think this gets to a couple of the questions earlier about the sense of conflict between the different policy guidelines that they're getting. They have policy that they're told about using a holistic assessment, encouraging the students' development of character and values and 21st century skills, the idea of assessing for learning versus of learning. But at the same time, that there hasn't been any statements about the nature of the assessments upon which students' lives are based are changing. And there's no discussion about what proportion of the marking is going to be given to assessments over the course of the year versus this final year test. So there's conflict there.
With that in mind, I don't know if you've been able to notice this yet, but I would imagine, I'm assuming that are schools held accountable by the central government at all in terms of their rankings, or do they lose autonomy, do they lose funding if their students don't perform as well, or is it just, it's not inconsequential, is it?
That's right.
So then I'm wondering if when you were talking about the learning, process learning versus outcomes learning, are you seeing different types of schools adopting these forms of assessments, and maybe schools that are doing really well in the rankings anyways can now focus more on these process measures because they're not worried about their students not doing well on the tests and suffering consequences for that, whereas schools that maybe aren't scoring as well on the rankings are feeling more compelled to teach through the test.
Yeah, that's right. So we don't have a lot of good evidence on that from any study yet, but we have some good anecdotal evidence. So we know some teachers in some of the really high-ranked schools, and the comments we get from them is that they're able to do process-oriented stuff because the students are going to do fine on the exam, and so we can do 21st century skills. Because if they're not doing well enough on the exam, their parents are going to pay for them to get a tutor, right? Or that's going to get figured out. On the other hand, and at the other side, we see that teachers in schools that are worried about their rankings are thinking about, okay, well, we need to make sure we can get students ready for the test, and so that might push the test prep focus. But at the other end, we're also seeing teachers that are saying that in their sort of lower band schools or in the normal technical which is like a vocational training type of stream, that they feel that for those students doing regular test prep to focus on the assessment, the students don't care about that. But if they try process-oriented assessment tasks that let students be more active and take ownership, that the students actually pay better attention and try harder. So I think it's kind of so far it seems to be a real variety of points. So that's part of one of the things we want to understand is how through the surveying, like this would be a representative sample, what are the different perceptions of the policy and contextual factors that they have, and what are their beliefs about assessment that they both at a broad sense and in a practical sense.
Is it still the case that admission to higher education is based on A-level results? So unlike here where we have state standardized tests that have no relationship to whether you can get into college, you have to take ACT or the SAT. Here, is it the case that your A-level results determine whether you can go to university and which kind of university?
That's right, yeah.
So it's more aligned. So, in some sense here, if you say, these standardized tests, we don't really care about them, there are fewer consequences. Where here, if you were to say, if suddenly your A-level pass rates went way down, those kids actually then lose the opportunities to go to college. So the stakes for individuals are much higher. In our system, it's like, meh.
Yeah, but that's interesting. Like Morgan and I were talking about this before we came over for the talk. That the connection between the assessment and what that means for students or for the system is really well aligned there. In the sense that you have to take the PSLE to get into secondary school, and then you have to do well in the O level to get into junior college, and then you have to do well at that to get into the good universities. NUS and the Nanyang Technological University where I am, those are like top 20 in the world universities. NUS is in the top 20, NTU is in the top 40. So they feel like they're really doing a great job. So the issues that they had about is the assessment aligned with getting into university, that's not a problem. The question is whether the assessments align to the language and the curriculum side. And so I know here there's some talk about the College Board is considering changing the nature of some of the assessments that they use in a sense to kind of be a lever to change high school curriculum, right? And so that's something that if the SEAB, Singapore Examination and Assessment Board, did that would make changes fast. But at the same time, I don't think the Minister of Education is going to be comfortable with if the percentage of students passing the A levels changed dramatically. That's not going to happen either. Because that parents are going to freak out, and it's going to be a big article on paper, etc. So some things can change quickly and some things can't.
But doesn't that argument then just say that the policy you're evaluating is doomed for failure? I mean,
well, I think
if those other levers aren't, if the rankings still matter and the kids' scores matter for getting into, why would you as a teacher change your assessment practices?
Mm-hmm. Well, so that's one of the things that, as I mentioned with some anecdotal work, we're finding that when we ask teachers about the high stakes exam and about that, then they emphasize, well, we have to get the students ready for the test, we have to make sure they're going to do well, and they think about the T-scores and the rankings and etc. But when we ask the teachers about these visions for the 21st century school, for understanding the sense of increasing students' sense of ownership of their learning, that kind of stuff, they're really excited about talking about formative assessment practices and changing how they assess and how they teach. So I think every teacher that I've worked with so far is weighing both aspects of we have the assessment outcome that we have to worry about, but we also are thinking about the student as a more general person than just the test score. And so that's why we think it'll be interesting to understand both what are the different emphases of these conceptions that each teacher has and how that might relate to other aspects. And then if we do see that there is direction, that it seems to be the direction that the policy is changing, and even though the assessments aren't changing overnight, but there is a sense that they are changing over time, just they haven't changed it so quickly yet. But there's a sense that there's movement in the direction of encouraging higher order thinking, trying to find ways to assess and 21st century skills, etc. And so with that looking down the road, it will be helpful to figure out what aspects could we intervene at the school or individual level that could support that. When the policy at the assessment side gets to where the policy at the curriculum side indicates it's going.
Just so you know, it's about 5 minutes to 1.
All right, so, etc. Yeah. And then, so the cultural values, there's some historical issues about like performativity. Teachers are concerned about what parents expect and the feedback and pushback they're getting about testing. And again, like what are parents are going to say when the students take home something that doesn't look like they're getting ready for the test. What are we doing this for? So we see there's some teacher factors, school factors, and national factors, etc. So these conceptions, we think they are influenced by these factors at different levels, and based on prior work, we know that those can be connected to their practices regarding assessment in the classroom. So we think that understanding how these conceptions are related to these other factors could give us some direction for future interventions that could help achieve the assessment practices that we're trying to get. And we're finalizing the questionnaire, and we'll do survey in February, March of 2013. So if I would conclude, discrepancies can exist between policy and practice, even in Singapore. And in order to, one of the avenues that we see for addressing that is to understand the difference between what teachers can do and what factors affect their decisions with assessment that they can control or can't, and then try to create interventions that can address those. This is a picture of the lobby of the National Institute of Education. So, that's it. Any additional questions, or for now, or you can feel free to email me later on.
I just think it's really fascinating to have some insight into a different system. I've been lucky enough to visit Singapore several times, and it's a huge challenge because when you're performing so well academically, but there's some sense that the kids don't have good enough social skills or aren't creative enough, or there's something lacking. But you don't want to take away that high level of academic skills that's been built on a very rigid individual student level accountability, high stakes tests, and you kind of want to weaken that, but the whole society is built around that meritocracy that's deeply competitive. And I think it's just really fascinating. Yet from a policy point of view, all the levers are here. It's so easy to do. You're training all the teachers in one place. It was so easy to change how you train teachers in principle, but you end up with the same policy implementation challenges at the classroom level that you do in a system like ours, which is so decentralized and completely different, where policy is like a mess. You know, here's I should get into the governor of Singapore. You know, here's a one-party democracy. You know, that basically can determine policy without having to muck it up with special interest in the legislature and all that stuff. And yet it's still difficult to get teachers at the classroom level to change instruction, to change assessment, to adapt over time. So I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, and one of the things that I have been reflecting a lot on the last few months is that what Ms. Lee in a paper was looking at, contrasting that for a lot of East Asian societies that did really well on TIMSS and have like the idea of like doing well on the assessment is a problem. But they're concerned about issues related to like creativity, innovation, students being able to collaborate across borders. And so a lot of those societies, Singapore especially, are looking to a kind of a loosening of their assessment policy. At the same time that like the UK and the US are tightening assessment policy. And when you ask people, talk to people in Singapore, they're like, it's kind of interesting that you know, the things that they want to get out of school are like what we often see students doing these days, you know, arguing with the teacher about what they think, instead of just sitting still, quietly. So, you know, and being willing to talk to each other in a group instead of, you know, lining up. And so someone could argue that the U.S. is going in the opposite direction and maybe isn't learning from the lessons that, you know, if we think of those as doing well, but they think they've got that down and now they're going somewhere else. I guess it's not really clear which direction is progress. I'm not sure either. So, but yeah,
Thank you.